anti-MSP articles, and I do see plenty of MSPs who write legitimate critiques of the MSP profession. Big red flag for me was a ton of customers want out of their MSP relationships. I don't buy that. Do most customers want to leave their MSP? I know it sounds like a crazy idea, but I'm reading an article right now that basically says, yeah, a lot of customers want out of their MSP relationship. And when I dug further into this article, I realized maybe they're not really talking about MSPs. Maybe they're talking about something else. And the further and further I read, the more convinced I became that there's something not lining up here. Something is off, and I felt compelled to talk about it. So that's what I'm going to do. Now, for the just to set the record straight, I'm not going to publish the article link that I'm referencing for a reason. Number one, the author might legitimately be an MSP. If they are, I apologize in advance. There could be some question about whether they really are a full-fledged MSP, but more on that in a bit. But the issues that they raise in the article, and it's a public article. It's not like it's a private restricted article, so it's out there. But I didn't want to call attention to this provider or their customers, but I did want to talk about at large the issues, the bigger issues that are referenced and brought up in the article, as I think it's only fair and we need to, especially when there's a potential negative consequence to our profession in managed services. So if you are interested in getting a link to the article, leave a comment, or better yet, just email me directly, and I will be happy to send you a link to this article that I'm referencing. But now I just wanted to set the record straight about why I wasn't going to include it in the show notes. So here's the premise of the article. The article is essentially about why a particular branch of customers, so it's a vertical market article, written in a publication directed at that particular market vertical. And it talks about why that particular client class don't like and want to leave their MSPs. And it's kind of, so written by an MSP, allegedly, was my first red flag, right? Why is an MSP talking about the MSP profession in such a negative way? I've been doing this a while, and so I've picked up a few things that I've seen over the last probably 5 years. It's really increased, where an author of an article will claim to be an MSP, and then in the article itself, they attack MSPs. And either they're the most self-loathing MSPs out there, and I suppose there are some out there that don't like who they are as an MSP. In my professional opinion and experience, more often than not, when this happens, it's not really an MSP. It's kind of a hybrid or a kind of a new, you've heard me use this term, the cyber consultants, who are very closely aligning themselves with MSPs, but they're really saying, no, we're not really an MSP. We're beyond the MSP. We're evolved. We've left our MSP skin a long time ago, and now we're something completely new and evolved and better. That's what they say. But that's been the typical approach when I see anti-MSP articles. And I do see plenty of MSPs who write legitimate critiques of the MSP profession, but they typically are better reasoned and they're more specific about a particular issue compared to these types of articles where they're just talking about, the first, big red flag for me was, ton of customers want out of their MSP relationships. I don't buy that. That's not my experience. When I talk to MSPs, that's not what they say. When we certify and audit MSPs, that's not what we find. More on that in a bit. So as I was reading through the article, and again, the premise of the article was dissatisfaction of customers with their MSPs and why they want to leave and what they're unhappy about. Those are legitimate issues that I would like to address. I came up with 5, not principles, but 5 kind of ideas or questions or just comments about this, not the article in specific, but about this topic in general. Because again, this idea transcends any market or service vertical. That, if you're in trucking, if you're in healthcare, legal, banking, financial services, entertainment, transportation, hospitality, food service, it doesn't matter. These issues as an MSP impact you regardless. So I'm just going to dive right in, talk about the 5 things that I spotted in the article, and hopefully you agree with them. If you don't agree with them, that's fine. Would love to hear your comments, as always. Number 1, and before I get into my 5 comments, one of the premises of the article is that, and I'll try to read it as close to an actual quote as possible. They claim, our authors claim, by referencing a research report that I am not familiar with from a company that I am not familiar with, but the company was a software vendor. I did look these guys up, and they do sell to MSPs. So you can always, I wouldn't hold my breath when you're talking about a company that sells software to MSPs and they produce research. Not always the case, but in this case, when they're making a claim like this, you really have to take it with a grain of salt or 2. The claim is 80% of MSP customers are so frustrated by their MSP that they want to replace them within the span of a year. I don't know when this was published, but I don't buy it. I'll tell you right now, I don't believe that for a second. I believe that they published this story, but 80% of managed services customers want to leave their MSP is so ridiculously on its face contrary to everything that we know in 40 years in managed services. 40 years. Yeah, going back to the early 90s. That's 4 decades. It's a long time. In 4 decades of managed services, the idea that such a large segment of managed services customers are unhappy with their MSP that they would want to leave is just not, I don't buy it, folks. I just don't buy it. That is not to say that customers don't leave their MSPs. They do. It happens a lot. But we're talking about, almost 80%? No, not 80%. What would cause that claim to be made? A couple things. Number 1, you're not really talking about an MSP. That's the obvious. The most easy explanation for a claim as ridiculous as 80% of managed services customers don't like their MSP and want to leave is they're not talking about an MSP. They're talking about something else. So this is in the article. This is what is being established or alleged, and this is my response. So number 1, yes, we do have bad managed service providers. I feel like that's a throwaway topic, right? That's like, there are bad anything, any example of a profession, a guild, a group, a union, whatever grouping that you want to come up with, there are bad examples in each of those. It's probably a guaranteed fact that's going to happen. There's nothing that is perfect. Perfection, at least in this life, in this era, and on this planet, is not something that you generally see ever. Don't want to get too philosophical there, but it's just, I think you all know that it's true. There are some bad MSPs. There are the bad MSPs. By the way, You may be asking, well, what experience does MSP Alliance have in the bad MSP business? Well, we've been calling out bad MSPs for a long time, almost 20 years. In fact, there's a great CRN article, titled "MSP Alliance is Bobbing for Bad Apples." I think it was written in 2006, 2000, somewhere around there. And we've been very upfront about calling out bad behavior and underperforming MSPs way below the standard of care and profession that we can expect. We're not afraid of that issue, but that is not very common. I mean, bad MSPs are really rare. Really rare. Do you have average MSPs? Sure. Yeah, like just they're not particularly exceptional. They do a decent job. Yeah, you probably have a fair amount of those. Does that make them bad? No. Would a average MSP produce a exaggerated statement like 80% of those types of customers want to change their relationship with that type of an MSP? Probably not. I mean, it would take a lot to get out of an average MSP relationship. I mean, that's the point, right? It would have to rise or sink to the level of being a really bad, maybe negligent MSP that has done some harm to you for you to actually want to leave. Again, red flag number one in this whole premise from this article. Yeah, there are bad MSPs, but there are not that many of them, quite few, in fact. Point number two, there are customers, end users, who engage legitimate managed service provider organizations, but who do not buy managed services. That's a head scratcher, so I'll restate that. There are customers who engage in MSP, but don't get managed services from that MSP. Now you're saying, Charles, how can that happen? Why would a customer have a relationship with a legitimate MSP and not be getting managed services? Well, I'll give you a great example. It used to be fairly common, especially in the early days of managed services, and it still happens today, although thankfully it's not happening as much, but it still does happen, where you have a client who reaches out to and finds an MSP, signs up with the MSP, and maybe they're doing some baseline IT management services, right? Maybe they're remote management, maybe they're backing up data, but that's it. The customer had a budget and that's all they could afford and that's all they're getting from that MSP. Now, they're not doing anything else. They're not securing their networks. They're not using password management tools. They're not, really paying attention to whether MFA is turned on for all accounts. They don't really have very good policies for which types of IT vendors are coming in and out of their network and doing work for them. Some of them even may be coming into conflict with the work that the MSP is doing. You have a lot of that happening, and it has been happening for a long time. Now, would you say that the MSP was at fault? Historically, my experience is no. In fact, in my experience, many of the situations that I just presented are discussed quite vocally by the MSP, typically at things like MSP World or in our peer groups or to our certification and audit examiners, who will say, well, we have these types of customers, but they're not really buying these security or other types of other than baseline services from us. They just don't want it. They're not paying for it. We have offered, but the client rejects. There's a lot of that, folks. I think you understand that. And so when I read a statement like 80% of clients don't like their MSP and want to leave, that's the second thing that comes to mind, is if they're really in a relationship and have engaged a legitimate MSP, have they availed themselves? Has the customer taken advantage of all the things that the MSP could do for them? Now, this typically shakes out when something bad happens, right? Now, the earliest examples were, kind of the Katrina example. Some of you, maybe you were old enough, you'll remember this, if you were active in managed services then. But during, 2005, and it certainly predates that, but 2005 and the Katrina storm that hit a lot of the southern United States, particularly Louisiana and New Orleans, gave us some really good case studies about managed services relationships where the client denied, rejected a service from the MSP, only to find out after the storm had wiped out their business, and they were, furiously trying to get back into operational status, days after this massive storm hits them. That, guess what? You rejected backup. No one was backing up your data. You said your internal, administrative assistant was doing the backups, swapping out the tape backups. And it's old technology. You go Google it. You'll look it up. Real thing, though. A lot of MSPs got caught in very uncomfortable situations because they had customers who were hurting, needed to get back up and be operational so they can, continue to do what they do. And many MSPs went out and well beyond their contract to try to reconstruct these networks and the data sets to get the customers operational again, despite the fact that the clients rejected those backup services in the first place. Again, to my point, there are a lot of examples of this where legitimate MSP, customer buys some managed services, or in some cases, the customer just says, you know what, I want to engage with you on a reactive basis. They don't even want managed services. They just say, I'll call you when I need you. Well, we all know that's not managed services. That's something else. Point number 3, there are more bad, air quotes, there are more bad break-fix providers than there are bad MSP. I put bad in air quotes because a bad break-fix company may actually be a perfectly functional break-fix reactive company. But I classify them as being bad because they're performing well below our current, what is our current global IT, cybersecurity, whatever you want to call it, minimum best practices standard. I make that claim based off of the many global IT frameworks, cybersecurity frameworks that currently do exist that are quite obvious for anyone who cares to read them, that maintain and set a minimum threshold of IT and or security for the average organization. And break-fix providers, as you've heard me say many times before, just don't have the capability to help their clients achieve that minimum threshold. And it doesn't mean that those break-fix companies are bad or intend bad things. They're just not equipped to do it. That's a managed services thing. All these IT frameworks, all these cybersecurity frameworks, to accomplish them, you have to have an MSP, or you have to have an internal IT department that is capable of replicating all the things that an MSP would. But you can't outsource that to a break-fix provider, and you can't have your internal IT department acting in a reactive break-fix manner achieve anything close to that minimum security, cybersecurity, or IT floor. It's just not possible. And so I make that statement. There are more bad break-fix companies out there than there are bad MSPs. And that statement alone would really address that article that I'm talking about. And it would address certainly that study that they talk about, that 80% of customers want to leave their MSP. 80% of customers want to leave their break-fix provider. That would be a great title. That would be an accurate title for that report. That I would believe. That would make so much sense. But 80% want to leave their MSP. No, you're not getting me that easy. I don't buy that for a second. Number 4, are most customers actually looking to replace their MSP? Again, a variation on a theme, but like I just said, if you were talking about a break-fix provider, a reactive provider, that would make sense. The claim that most clients are looking to replace those providers, I would agree with. Based off of a sampling of just the certified MSP organizations that we have seen over 20 years at MSP Alliance, I would say that the vast majority of those companies, and I say this knowing full well that client customer retention is an element of our standard. The Unified Certification Standard for MSPs is a standard for MSPs, and it does contain specific testing metrics around customer retention, because that's an indicator of whether the MSP is operating at a optimal level or not. So we have this historical data. And I'll tell you, we do not sit on anything that even comes close to a year or even one customer, one MSP, who has had anything close to 80% of their clients turn over in any given 12-month period. I mean, if the MSP went out of business, maybe, but that's, how often does that happen? But an MSP who is in continuous operations, we've never seen something like 80% of their customers turning over. That would be catastrophic to the managed services profession if that were the norm, if that were even happening. Explanation? It doesn't happen. What this author is actually talking about is not an MSP. They're actually talking about break-fix, reactive IT shops, not MSPs. And finally, I want to address the why. Why write this type of an article if you are claiming to be an MSP, as this author, this company, claims to be? And I said at the beginning of this episode that the author of this and other types of articles similar to this typically take an approach where they are being very antagonistic and anti-MSP, while at the same time claiming that they themselves are an MSP. In my experience, this phenomenon has been happening more regularly in the last 5-6 years, and I've been very transparent with all of you that it's my opinion that these types of companies are really cybersecurity consulting firms that are running an EDR or MDR technology, along with maybe some pen testing as a service, vulnerability scanning, and all good things, but they don't do the other. They're not backing up data. They're not doing remote monitoring and management. They're not actually helping the customers with anything other than deploying an EDR type of technology, which is good, but it's not a complete managed service. It's not even close. And so that would be a good explanation for motive, for why this type of an article would be published directly attacking MSPs. Because, right? How do you allege that 80% of customers want to leave an MSP? That's not a very flattering picture of any profession. But why would you write it? Why would you put your name towards something like that if you confused break-fix shop for an MSP? That's how. So to summarize all of this, number one, we recognize there are bad MSPs. There are not very many of them, and it's our hope that we get rid of all those bad MSPs as quickly as possible. I mean, that's why we established a standard. It's why we've been in the certification of MSP business for 20 years. We believe in the integrity of this profession. We believe in the work that all of these MSPs do globally. It's very important, and there is no room for bad actors like this. But thankfully, they don't happen very frequently at all. And there are average MSPs. There are customers who are unhappy with what their MSP is doing. Are there 80% of them out there per MSP? No. Not even close. I've made my point, my views very clear on that. If you're a customer and you're wondering, maybe you've read that article that I talked about, maybe you're listening to this podcast for the first time and wondering, well, how do I find a good MSP? Well, you have to interview them. You have to get their credentials. It's a really good idea if you're talking to this MSP and you like them, you ask for third-party certifications. You ask for something like a Cyber Verify report. You ask to see it. You ask to read it, to look at what their capabilities actually are, as evidenced and attested to by a third-party organization, right? You're not just looking at marketing materials. You're looking at what they actually can do, what they told a third-party auditor they can do, and that third-party auditor actually tested them on that. Ask for those types of credentials. Ask to see their agreements. Look to see what type of agreement they have. What does it say? What are the terms? And you have to get along with them, and you have to have a reasonable understanding of what you want to get out of that relationship. Be very transparent with that MSP. And I think pretty quickly, you'll find out whether you're dealing with a real MSP or not. If you're dealing with a break-fix company, you're going to understand that very, very quickly. So I would say, talk to the MSP in question, ask for their credentials, ask for their contracts, see and hear what they're going to do for you. Ask questions. If they're unwilling to give you good answers and you don't think that those answers are coming quickly enough or easily enough, or if they don't pass the smell test, move on. But a good MSP will be happy to explain what they do, even breaking down the very technical things that they do into non-technical terms. A good MSP will do that. I know that for a fact. And that is one of the best ways that you can start to get comfort with a real MSP and make sure that they are aligned to what you want to do. And you will be in the camp of so many customers over the last 4 decades who have engaged with an MSP and have had a very positive, meaningful, successful relationship with them. Give it a try. I know it'll work for you.